Welcome, colleagues. Good to see you joining us. I see some are still making their way in the room. We'll give them a minute or two to join us. Important to note that we are getting to the latter parts of the program. So great to see you with us on the journey. Welcome back. For those who had a bit of a public holiday on Thursday and Friday, a banking holiday, we hope that you had a good break and that you had a fun, enjoyable weekend. If we could go to that next slide, we can talk about what we're dealing with today. We are, of course, in Module 3, Part B of Module 3, which is focused on how we create alternative futures and their implications. If you think back, you'll remember that we had a great session with Johan about a week ago, teaching us about the 3 horizons model and using the 3 horizons model to derive implications for the UN. You may remember we spoke about that. We're going to revisit some of that material as we think about today, getting deeper into this topic of how do we derive implications using foresight. If we could go to that next slide, just to contextualize that a little bit. What's interesting about this particular part of the program, you might say that this is where this is what we might call the business end. Very often when clients buy foresight, or they pay someone to assist them with foresight, or they build a foresight capability, this is very often the critical point at which the so what question gets answered. So you've done all this foresight, you have a view of what the world might look like in the future, so what? What does this mean for us? And so if you look at where we are in the program, just looking at our schedule here for a minute, we've covered the foresight foundations in Module 1. We've looked at how to explore futures as part of the ordering process in Module 2. And we've moved into this element of insights into action. In other words, what are we going to do with that foresight? It's very important to note that this, of course, comes ahead of the last module, where we will be talking about integrating futures. In other words, how do we take this capability into an institution and expand the ability of the institution to do this? But we're right here in the middle of Module 3, looking at alternative futures and implications, getting ready to think about how we turn those into strategies. If we can go to that next slide. It's also interesting to note that this is in the 3rd phase of this 4-stage process that we use. You've seen this many times by now, how we go from scoping to ordering. Now, it's interesting to note, if you had done the scoping, but you may have neglected 1 or 2 key questions that the client has, or maybe there was a question that only emerged through the ordering stage, it's not unusual to go back and spend a bit more time scoping to really understand what the foresight needs to address, and then to spend a bit more time in ordering. It's very often the case that there's a bit of an iterative process between scoping and ordering. But importantly, once you start getting to implications, you're really starting to translate those insights into actionable results on the ground. What does it mean for us as an organization? And because of that, if we could go to that final slide that I'll be covering, because of that, what typically tends to happen at this stage is you really move strongly into this, what we call the convergent phase. Now, why is this so important? Because in the foresight process, there will often be those individuals that feel quite uncomfortable with ambiguity. They don't like open-ended questions. They don't like processes that seem to complicate things more, bring more complexity in the room. You might find these individuals that really appreciate pragmatic, time-bound, concrete, actionable, worthwhile inputs. Now, this is the part of the process that typically speaks to them. You might have others who are more exploratory in their preference, who feel like we're getting to the business end and it's less fun and interesting. But really, getting the implications phase right can very often be the difference between a foresight process that sat on a shelf somewhere versus a foresight process that made tangible change or impact in the organization. And so as we get to convergence, as we get to making choices, implications really helps us to do that. And so in that final slide, on slide 6, what I'll just mention there is that implications are really about systematically working through the consequences of the futures. To help us understand that better and explore the various ways of doing that, We've brought Peter Glenday back. By now, you know Pete very well. Pete, welcome, and we're in your hands.
Thanks, Marius, and it's great to be back with everyone for this session today. As Marius said, I'm going to be introducing a few different ways that we try to think about implications systematically when we're in this stage of the project. There are lots of different ways of doing implications work. Some tools and techniques are used commonly in foresight work. Others will be tools and approaches that you're familiar with in the work that you already do in policy, strategy, innovation. So don't think of the implications phase as something that's necessarily unique to foresight work. It's critical, finding different methods in different ways, really kind of mashing up sometimes tools to get to the right kind of implications for the work that you're doing. But I'm going to spend a bit of time today talking through some of the ways that we tend to do this as futures practitioners. And I'll start with this slide, which talks about the why, what, and how of implications work. Quite often, and part of the purpose, as Marius was explaining, around diverging to create choices and explore alternative futures, is to really think about what different possibilities might there be in the future. To spend some time exploring these and thinking through those "so what" questions, and doing this in a way that avoids you jumping too quickly to conclusions without considering alternative possibilities. You don't always have to go through scenarios work. That's definitely one way of doing it. And some of the tools I'll talk about today work really well when you do have a set of scenarios. But really, it's kind of thinking about those possibilities, thinking systematically about different possible futures, and really only then thinking about what that means for decision making today. So the implications phase is really a systematic process for thinking through those implications and focusing in on key issues, questions, or decisions that really matter to you and matter to the system that you're working with. For those of you who were here last week, you started using one of the implications tools we often use, Three Horizons. For those who missed it, I'll recap that tool in a minute just so you get an understanding of what happened. And I'll also introduce concepts around visioning, wind tunneling, and putting this all together in strategic options or using a kind of policy portfolio approach later in the session. And these are all tools that can help you understand different implications. But which tools you might choose will really depend on what you're trying to achieve. So through the scoping phase, you will have put some boundaries on both the scope, the system, and also the questions that you're exploring fundamentally. Sometimes you're really focused on trying to challenge assumptions. Sometimes it will be avoiding future surprises and threats. Sometimes around trying to change or shape that future or anticipate how it might emerge. Sometimes all you're trying to do is really to align your community and build action around change. And there's different ways of combining tools, as I said earlier, to achieve some of these aims and ambitions. And if you think back to some of the earlier modules where the slide was used, and to some of the work that Kat talked about earlier around the real purpose for why you're doing futures work, just being clear on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve can really help you to kind of focus in on the implication stage and making sure it's connecting back to decision making. So the tool, those of you who were there last week used, the Three Horizons, is a really great tool for understanding systems change and to get into some of the kind of tough conversations you might need to have around the future. It can also be quite powerful as it can help you to capture the attention of decision makers and audiences, thinking in those kind of multiple horizons and connecting back some of the longer term implications to kind of shorter term strategy, policy, innovation work. And communication is also key. And whilst we were doing the Three Horizons work, this was really focusing in on some of those, it was, as I was saying, so focusing in around systems change. But there's time and a place for spending more time up front, exploring the scenarios and the worlds. And there's sometimes you want to be focusing on that transition period. So I'm just going to tell a bit of a story about a piece of work we did with WHO early on in the Western Pacific Regional Office, early on when COVID was kind of emerging and some of the implications were currently being explored. And they really wanted to understand how some of the potential uncertainties and developments around the pandemic could play out over time. So taking a slightly intentional look at what might be happening 5 years out, and linking back to what the implications might be for how the system might respond early on during the pandemic. So we designed and took a group of public health professionals and other experts from across WHO in the Western Pacific region. We took them through a rapid foresight exercise to think about kind of what different future scenarios might look like. We used an archetypes approach, looking at what a growth scenario, collapse, discipline, transformational scenario might look like, to create 4 different worlds through which to explore this. The idea is to really take that longer term perspective, to help them unpick potential implications and being conscious that there are lots of different systems at play and that decisions made today may have long-term fundamental impacts on the future. And also the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty around how the COVID pandemic might play out, as well as how economic impacts might play out over time and how systems might respond. But we needed some way of connecting from these 4 possible worlds back to decision-making, to strategy and policy and the so whats. And really there are different ways of doing this, and we use multiple lenses to explore this at different levels. We were looking globally and internationally to see what might happen in terms of how different stakeholders might respond, how foreign policy interests or different governments might impact, and to look at that kind of global and international perspective. We drilled into the country context to really understand what might happen in the Western Pacific region, how might different countries respond, because that global perspective was important, but without that country context, it was impossible for us to really think through what those impacts were going to be. How might different health systems and different countries respond? How might values play into this? What matters? And then ultimately then having understood that and looking at it through country profiles, drilling in to think about what does that mean for people's health needs, health status, and for the health systems. So really trying to understand and spend time exploring the implications of those scenarios at those different levels. And there were different tools that we used. We used some kind of exploratory tools and narrative techniques to explore systems, values, and changes. We used personas to try and think through the needs of different communities and vulnerable groups. And then we use some of the more classical futures techniques such as backcasting, wind tunneling, and some techniques like SWOT to explore strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, to really think through what does that mean for the health system and what does that mean for WHO and for country teams. And if we hadn't gone through that scenarios process and we hadn't gone through that, spent the time exploring the scenarios and drilling down through the multiple lenses, there was a risk of rushing too quickly to make assumptions or guesses around the future. And by spending time exploring these different perspectives, it helped WHO to think through what some of the opportunities were, what some of the longer term implications of things like vaccine passports might be for vulnerable populations early on in the pandemic, or ways to really leverage or take advantage of changes that were likely to happen over the next 5 years, to really make sure that there was a quicker recovery for health systems that might be knocked back. And so the point of this slide is just to make you realize that there's lots of different implications tools out there and lots of ways of stringing them together. But really thinking about exploring the world, imagining that world in transition, looking across the different scenario sets can bring you different insights and perspectives. So for those of you who missed it and I went away last week, I'm just going to quickly talk through the 3 horizons model, and then I'll come back to talk about visioning and wind tunneling and backcasting. So this is the 3 horizons model, and Johan introduced this last week, and I'll ask him just to share a few reflections on the process in a minute. Effectively, there's 3 lines on the page. There's this red line, which is high in the now, and is falling over time, is the first horizon. And this is kind of a dominant current patterns and systems and values. There's a horizon 2, which is this transitionary horizon, and there's a horizon 3, which is where you may see pockets of change that are already happening in the system today, but that becomes more prevalent over time. So it's really that kind of system change model. And we used it last week to go through 5 steps. The first one was to think about what the scenario might look like in the future. You can also use it to think about what your vision might look like in that future as well. But where might you need to get to? then stepping back to think about how the present looks and what looks different today. Looking for those pockets of change that are already happening. Thinking about what we need to preserve in the present for that scenario or for your vision. And then in the middle, thinking about those challenges, opportunities, and threats that you might see in the transition period. And you spent time last week thinking about those two scenarios that we introduced. Scenario one, which was looking at a world in which global conflict was persisting, where there's economic uncertainty, migration, and deepening global inequality. And scenario two, where global conflicts is dissipating, with some economic recovery and resurgence of global trade, and different ecological consequences in both those scenarios. And by exploring that transition, there are a number of themes that emerged in that kind of interim Horizon 2 period. And we summarize this on the slide, but I'm not going to go into these in too much detail now. But there are issues around what structures might look like, how to transition to a future in which where you might see increased migration, where there's climate change issues, resource shocks, questions around financing and energy transition. There are risks around the potential for isolationism and nationalism, and there's needs for kind of new blocks, new alliances, new approaches to governance, and a need for structural reform. So by exploring that kind of those future scenarios, exploring where we are today and thinking about that transition, you started to kind of identify some issues or questions or themes that you as a multilateral system might need to address in that transitional period. And Johan, I'm going to just ask if there's anything you wanted to share from last week at this point before I move on.
Well, just quickly, thank you for your work last week. What we did, basically, the outcome was on two levels. The one was thinking about these themes. So we extracted the themes below from the work you've done in all the horizon blocks of the different blocks in the template. So we sort of went over everything and tried to extract some of the most important themes coming out. You also had great ideas for innovation, which some of them were quite practical. So we're not going to focus on that. This is one level up just in terms of the different themes. And as you can see there, there's something about a global consensus, the lack around that, trust. You had something about reshaping alliances, interesting ideas in terms of alliances in Asia, which might look differently than we think of, maybe excluding China, for instance, or alliances around specific technologies elsewhere in the globe or globally even. There was a lot of thinking about obviously restructuring governance, restructural reform in the UN. You had some interesting ideas there, but then also the principle and the ideas around governance as a whole, where there's a little bit of a devolution, shift to devolution and increased representation as well. And you had some comments on technology, something about isolationism and nationalism, and also a continued push for multilateralism as a future tool to bring peace, which was a surprising and obviously, given who we are, but a surprising positive point in all the blocks, really. There was also something about migration. And then I think the last comment was a little bit about focusing on how do we handle or mitigate or contain shocks, for instance, around the energy transition, how to manage that, and then also rising food prices and climate change overall. So just to give you a quick overview. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Johan. Marius, I can see your hand is up, but thank you for that summary. Marius, please jump in.
Thanks, Pete. I just wanted to make one observation, which is important, I think, in the program, is that this particular use of foresight in this live challenge is a very broad topic. Like it's the globe, and it's very high level, right? What's the future of global conflicts? So, for instance, if you do a foresight topic that is both high level and broad, the implications you will find tend to be fairly high level and broad, because that's where the focus is pitched. And so I think it's important to make the point that you could do a similar exercise where you could either narrow the project. So in other words, instead of saying global conflict persists, you might say conflict persists in South Sudan between this group and that group. And by narrowing it, you would then get very narrow and specific implications. Or you might make the level lower. It might be, community level conflicts between two communities, in which case you get very granular implications. And so I think it's necessary to point that out, because as you design a foresight process, a key question to ask is, are the beneficiaries of this looking for high-level, broad inputs, or are they looking for those very narrow, very tactical, applied inputs? Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Marius. And I think going back to the WHO example I shared before and drawing from kind of experience and other work, the two ends that Marius has just been talking about aren't exclusive. You can have that very global context, and by having multiple lenses or by designing the implications process, you can also develop stories or vignettes of change, for instance, applying that kind of global framework to specific countries or regions or questions or challenges, or thematic areas of interest, and really using those scenarios as a structure to then add more depth and layers onto as well. But if you start too narrow, sometimes it can be hard to see some of those implications that are happening of change in that external environment that might be happening internationally or regionally that might play out and ultimately impact and have systemic impacts on kind of country context or specific thematic areas. So just coming back to that idea of change coming from the outside. So coming back to so what's, through the approach last week with the 3 horizons and this exploring the scenarios, this gave us an understanding of different futures and how they might emerge. It also gave us a view of gaps, obstacles, opportunities that might emerge in the horizon 2 in that transition period. And as Johan said, this gave a set of innovations about how you might want to respond to these emerging challenges or opportunities. But it didn't bring a lens in around values or what you might want to happen. And there's a whole discipline around and history around whether values should be up front and center in foresight work. A lot of traditional scenarios work is quite reactionary. It assumes that you can kind of almost pare back to just reasoned knowledge, kind of map potential outcomes and then be in that kind of reactionary responsive frame. But by thinking about values and bringing in that kind of what do you actually want, your desires, your goals, your values into the system through a visioning process, this can help you identify opportunities for change, ways to address barriers and ways to kind of enable systems to shift. And that can be a really important exercise along a set of scenarios to help you think about what are those critical path dependencies or ways or interventions that you can put in place to shape the future. And scenarios ultimately, they talk about a pathway that emerges. Thinking about the future, working back, you can figure out what some of those steps might be on the way. But we're also looking at what are those interventions or innovations we want that can either steer us towards a more desirable future or away from a less desirable outcome or a particular scenario that you're not incentivized to let emerge. And ultimately, some things are out of your control. So sometimes you will be reacting to scenarios that emerge, and other times you can shape it. But bringing that visionary lens can help you understand and also catalyze change around a particular agenda. So good visions are powerful. They're typically tangible and quite plausible. It's often written in active and present tenses, so they become easy to relate to, and people can start imagining inhabiting that kind of more visionary future. A desired future can also be a deeply political endeavor. It needs to be tested widely. You need to be working with your stakeholders to understand what they want, not just what you think they want. And it can also quite often challenge deeply entrenched power structures or systems that people may want to maintain. So really trying to bring different people into the conversation, help them understand the different perspectives about what they want from the future. That can be a really important participatory approach to take. But it should also be linked to action. And the two quotes in the slides, the one that talks about vision without action is a daydream, but action without vision is a nightmare. It's quite powerful. You need to know what you want and what you're trying to shape, but you also need to know how you can try and get there at the same time. So this is an example of a vision that we worked with some energy distribution companies in Nigeria. And the idea was they were thinking about how they can both create a more prosperous and sustainable future for themselves as an organization, but also how they can work with the communities and society, individuals living within the villages, the towns that they're supporting, to create a more prosperous Nigeria. And we went through a scenarios process to look at potential outcomes. There were quite a lot of questions around decentralization of the markets, what happens to the economy, political situation, typical factors that you might imagine playing in. But when we looked at the vision for what they wanted, this was really about what kind of world are we trying to live in? What's that kind of almost fifth scenario, as it's sometimes called, of a more preferred future. And they wanted to be living in a world which was prosperous, in an inclusive society with gender participation. They wanted improved education, better integration, a more diverse economy, and a thriving northern Nigeria, and an unregulated power market. Most of this is outside of their control. It's that external vision that, yes, they can influence some of it. They can work towards supporting education or lobbying for regulation within the deregulation in the power markets. But most of the time, this was in the external world. It's that world that they'd like to be living in. And then they can look to think about what they can start to influence and shape. As another example, this is some work done in Singapore. They wanted to, it's quite a structured society with a potentially unusual social contract. But they once realized that to have an effective vision, they needed to be speaking to their citizens, millennials, younger and older people, and find out what they want from the government. So they went through a participatory exercise to engage hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people from society into the process. And it came up with different perspectives, and then a set of priorities emerged from the process, particularly around sustainability, economic prosperity, and the environment. But then crucially, they did that process of linking it back to action. So how can we develop targets for where we want Singapore to be in 2030, and how can we work towards that? But again, thinking about what that enabling environment looks like, and then thinking about what you can do to achieve it, not going straightly to what is the vision for me as a company or as a government, but what is a vision for that world, and then how do we try and create it? When developing visions, there's many different ways of doing it, but we just try to think about the world out there, try to be able to explain where every line in your vision has come from, make sure it's consistent and reflects any kind of modeling or logic that exists within your scenarios as well. And try to avoid too much focus on what the organization does or the community or the government, instead of describing that change in the external world. And make sure that you understand the values that you're bringing in. So we're going to move into an exercise now on visioning, and then we'll come back for some reflection. And we want you to revisit the challenge that we have been exploring around the future of multilateralism and global governance. And we want you to do this in the context of the scenarios that you were exploring last week. And we appreciate that not everyone was there, but we'll be putting you into groups of 3 to go through an exercise with 2 others in your groups. And you'll have a copy of this slide, which Johan will add to these slides, which Johan will add into the chat, so you can access it through HouseSpace or through the PDF that's added in a second. But what we want you to do is take some time to think about some of the themes that emerge from the 3 Horizons exercise. And again, you'll get these on the download. And we want you to think about, okay, given these themes, if we were to imagine what a vision for the future of multilateralism and global governance would look like, what would that mean for how this theme could look in the future? And these themes are ones that have come out of your scenarios work. So they've either come from conversations around scenario 1 or scenario 2. And this is just to show you the instructions. So we'll have about 5 minutes to get to know each other in your groups, and then 15 minutes for the exercise. So think about one of the themes that emerge from the 3 Horizons, pick one, and have a discussion about what that would look like. So this is an example where we've picked the theme around technology driving polarization. So in our vision for the future of multilateralism and global governance, we might imagine that technology is being used to support peace and build trust with increased digital participation and representation. This is just an example. This might mean we want greater regulation of emerging technologies and a new compact for digital commons as a global public good. If these feel familiar, it's because they're linked to our common agenda. But have that conversation for 15 minutes, pick one of the themes, and try to imagine what that looks like in your vision for the future. So Johan, thank you for sharing in the chat. We're going to break out into threes for now, and then come back for a debrief and to find out how your experience of doing this visioning exercise was, and then we'll kind of move to break. So have 5 minutes to start your to get to know each other in a group, and then 15 minutes for the exercise. And we'll remind you in the chat to keep you to time. If you can make sure that you've downloaded either the link in the chat or you have access to Housepace, and then when you're in your breakout groups, if someone's joining by phone, make sure that they're able to see the slides or share your screen in the breakout groups. And we'll see you back here in a few minutes, in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I think it's okay to open the breakout groups now, Ruth. Hey everyone, just waiting for the final few people to join us from the breakout groups. Welcome back. We're going to have a quick bit of feedback and discussion now on how you found the visioning exercise, and in particular kind of be interested in hearing from some of the groups about what you found, what you felt was important for your vision in relation to your theme, and how you found a discussion of visioning. We've done this in quite an unstructured way, just drawing on your own experiences about what you think is important. There are some more structured approaches to visioning that you can use. A lot of them will start with asking kind of what is already good about today that you might want to preserve, a bit like the 3 horizons, asking what might be and getting you to dream or fantasize or imagine new possibilities about what should happen, what could happen. Then coming up with an idea about what should happen, and then working back to think about how you make it happen. You can do this without scenarios, as we said earlier, just jump straight to vision. But having a set of scenarios can also bring that kind of valuable perspective about some of the things that are less desirable that you might otherwise not be thinking about as a useful action into that kind of dreaming and thinking about what should be. So I'm just going to pause. Would anyone like to jump in and share how they found the visioning exercise and what they came up with? Please either come off mute or put your hand up and we'll invite you in. Any volunteers? How did you find that exercise? Or any questions about visioning as well?
I'll jump in and say something briefly. I think our group was struggling a bit just getting to the agreeing between us what that vision might look like. I mean, we sort of had our theme, and we weren't able to then work back and sort of think about what the paths might look like to getting there and then what might need to be avoided. So it probably took us too long to be able to articulate the overall vision. But it was an interesting discussion to sort of really imagine something that's quite different. So we were looking at the multilateralism and where it might be going. And so we were talking about, completely changing decision-making bodies of the UN, taking it out of New York, some very out there visioning, but we didn't really get to consensus and then be able to work back from there. Yeah.
That's not that surprising, Tamara, and thank you for sharing. I'm curious if what took you time to get to that vision? Was it the alignment around values, or was it kind of a shared purpose, but a disagreement about how you might make that happen?
I don't think we had any real disagreement. We were just putting some real ideas out there and then sort of seeing how if other people agreed or didn't. I mean, so there wasn't any big disagreement, but maybe it took us too long to get there. Our introductions took too long. No, but we didn't disagree. It was sort of really stretching our imagination a little bit to sort of think of something quite different from where we are right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you. That's helpful, because having that permission, that time to dream and reimagine can be very, very tricky. And I think we're doing this in a slightly artificial process, but if you, as you go through a visioning exercise, giving people that ability to pause and reimagine rather than assume that things have to be like today can be both quite powerful, but also quite challenging to unlock that imagination. And the benefit of using scenarios is it gets people into that possibility space and thinking about different alternatives before going to visioning. And that can sometimes be a valuable step. I can see Ariana's hand up. Please jump in.
Hi, Peter. Hi, everyone. The discussion was really informative. We were really lucky to have in our group Hoffman, who shared very interesting data about current migration flows. However, I feel that same as with Tamara's group, somehow we were a bit stuck, like on this probabilistic way of thinking instead of managing to free ourselves to talk about normative and desirable. And, like daring to be bold or coming up with a real vision that has the potential, like to motivate and inspire. So actually from a futures design perspective, I hear you when you say that working with scenarios gives somehow, like fosters the reflexivity to think of diverse options, but yeah, I'm a bit. I'm wondering whether like at the same time perhaps it limits the potential of being bolder and going out from trends and probable space to imagine the desirable one. Thank you.
You're on mute, Peter.
Thanks, Ruth. I was just saying, Ariana, that's a good question about whether it's gives you enough flexibility to really imagine new possibilities. And I might ask Johan in a second to kind of come in with some any reflections from the piece of work he was working on in Mozambique around peace and reconciliation, because they used an approach there which was called appreciative inquiry, which is really about taking people into that possibility and imagination space and facilitating participatory conversations around people's hopes and dreams rather than going through a scenario process envisioning. I'm just going to put up the 3 horizons slide again quickly as well, because you can use 3 horizons really to think about what to avoid going to scenarios. You can use it as a model just for getting into discussions around future visions. So understanding what the current dominant view of the world is and really challenging that from different people's perspectives. Then thinking about what the future vision could be and spending that time reimagining and thinking about possibility before then thinking about how that system in transition might look like. And that can be quite powerful as well. Johan, do you want to share anything around Mozambique at this point as well?
Yes, yes, for sure. So what was interesting about Mozambique was it was a project that we wanted to get local input, or just local visions and local understandings and ideas of how we can Mozambique can be rebuilt after the hurricane, and also in terms of disarmament and peace building and reconciliation. But the idea was to actually get a local view of how that could be done and service local ideas instead of coming from the outside and sort of dictate or share normative ideas of what should be happening. So what happened was we had all these representatives from civil society, even some political parties as well, which was part of the whole process, which was for about a week. And what we did was we didn't do really visions or scenarios for that matter. What we did was really focusing on the hopes and fears in a little bit in a participative inquiry way, where they constructed hopes and fears, and then from the hopes extracted a plausible or a possible vision that they would really like to see where Mozambique would be going, and based on that, then they totally jumped through the scenarios, over that, went into the vision, and out of the vision really constructed some great ideas, really, which was very practical and very useful in terms of how they could, in communities, but also nationally, even linking up to the defense force, etc., but also then building back in, locally with communities. So there was a lot of great ideas, and I think what was what the project also demonstrated was the fact that when people talk about the future, which is a little bit further off, after they've had the opportunity to voice their fears, not just their hopes, but also their fears, and they talk about the future, then it puts them in a different mind space, and not just trying to solve the current problems, but really that imaginative space is really, and that moment of imagination is really helpful to, cross bridges and go across borders and have people think ways they wouldn't have before, which is a bit much more reconciliatory than, the amnosity, in a sense, that would be present when we think about the present itself.
Thanks, Johan. And if you go back to scenarios literature, again, we'll pick this up after the break in a bit more as we talk about some other implications techniques. You'll see in scenarios literature, there's a lot of scenarios work that is purely reactive. It's making an assessment about what could happen, and then preparing to mitigate or respond to that future as it emerges, which is great and definitely important for building risk and resilience. But the idea of bringing in that kind of preferred futures and that normative visioning approach, and really setting that kind of agenda is something that has gone through patterns and waxed and waned over the years around futures work, but it is seeing a lot more attention than it was even a couple of decades ago. And I just wanted to, before break, just to put up the slide from our common agenda, which, as you know, was effectively in some ways a massive visioning process. Data was collected from online through the survey, through dialogue logic processes to understand what people wanted, as well as some of the opportunities and risks for the future. And then the different statements within this are, in a way, are vision statements about what the United Nations is wanting to about the world that they want to create. And values are so implicit to the work that you do at the UN that it's really important to kind of be aware of that and be conscious of that through the futures work that you're doing, but also be really thinking about how you can listen to and work with women, with youth, with different stakeholders who might have potentially quite different ways of thinking about the future, of different visions for the future, different hopes and fears, as Johan was talking about, and bringing that into your futures work. We're going to pause now for 5 minutes and have a short break, and we'll pick up about 8 past the hour for the next session, but we'll give you a 5-minute rest break. If there's any other questions, please do share them in chat and we'll pick them up as we restart in 5 minutes time. So thank you all, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Welcome back. I hope you had a quick break. We're going to continue now, just introducing a couple more tools that you can use for implications. So our kind of scenarios and three horizons approach gave us an understanding of different futures and how they might emerge, a view of the kind of gaps, obstacles, and opportunities at Horizon 2, and an idea around potential innovations to respond to them. We've also now talked about kind of elements of a vision about the future that we want. So what would be next? As we've said many times already to this session, there's lots of different implications tools out there. One that can be quite effective with different, when you do have a set of scenarios, is wind tunneling, which is an approach that may be familiar in other terms, like stress testing or cross-impact type analysis. But the idea is that it takes a set of ideas or goals or objectives that you have and tests them systematically against different scenarios and potentially against your vision. It can also be used to generate new scenarios, but we won't go into that today. And what do we mean by wind tunneling? This is a very crude example. It comes from a piece of work that the UK government did as part of an initiative with the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development, looking at South Sudan and what some of the strategies or options might be in the event of a regime change or a breakdown in security. And whether a new government would enact elitist policies or kind of be supportive of kind of the poorer people within society. And the idea was they looked at these kind of two key uncertainties, a bit like we've been doing with the scenarios, and came up with a set of 4 scenarios that would either represent a secure environment with pro-poor policies, or elitist environment, elite and secure environment, an insecure environment with pro-poor policies, or elite insecure environment. You don't really need to understand the details of the scenarios or the options. It's more the kind of logic of the table. And what they asked is whether, in the event of these scenarios emerging, would our potential options of us acting as a funding broker, or providing technical assistance, or supporting advocacy, would they work in the different scenarios? And they gave a tick or a cross. So yes, it would work, or no, it wouldn't work. So this is very much imagining that scenario has come about, not what we're doing in the interim, but this scenario has emerged. Would our policy work? And they mapped this across, as you can see, the tick and cross. And that gave them a basic assessment. You can see number 5 would work in all 4 scenarios. It seems quite robust, as would number 4. Whereas some strategies would only work in 1 or more scenario. And that's a very basic idea of wind tunneling. If I kind of go to the next slide, which starts layering on a bit of color, they also ask kind of, okay, so yes, we have these kind of robust strategies in the blues, number 4 and 5, where you have the ticks in all the columns. But how important are these strategies for us if that scenario emerges? And in the case of Fortress Nirvana, which is this pro-poor secure environment, the idea is that being a funding broker would become really important, but it's a risky strategy as it only works in that scenario. So they wouldn't want to do that and rely on it happening if the other 3 scenarios emerge. It obviously wouldn't be effective. So how can they start to kind of think about that? Which ones are robust? Which ones are significant? Which are important but risky? And the idea is, by doing that and having an assessment, you can start to choose and make judgments between different options that you might want to put into place if a scenario were to emerge. You could do this in a transition as well, if thinking about that horizon 2, but really this kind of mapping is quite effective if you're in that kind of reactive state, and testing whether that works. And you can also put your visioning down as an extra column to say, okay, would this work if our vision were to come about? What this doesn't get into then is, okay, well, what if we have a limited amount of funding or capabilities? Do we have those kind of core capabilities to be able to achieve that? That would be another level of assessment downstream of this. But if you can pick a set of strategies, so say option 1, because it's really important in that Fortress Nirvana world, and option 2, because it works in the other 3, then you might have quite a robust and effective strategy. So it's a way of seeing, do these options work? Are they important? And assessing them across scenarios. To do this, you need to have an understanding of the scenarios. You need to have an understanding of the ideas, and you need to have an understanding of kind of what's that kind of outcome that you want to achieve as well. So what we're going to do is go to another breakout exercise and ask you to do this for a few minutes before we then talk about backcasting and putting this all back together. So you had 2 scenarios from last week. Again, these were on the downloads, which Johan shared in chat, and I think we'll share again. What we'd like you to do is take 3 of the 3 ideas that we've pre-selected for you, because this is more of a pedagogic exercise to get you into the practice of doing this exercise. The first 2 came directly from your scenarios work last week and through Horizons work. So we know that idea 1 came out of scenario 1, so we assume that it would work to strengthen that scenario. Idea 2 came out of scenario 2, so I'm assuming that it will work. You might disagree, but we're assuming that the groups came up with it because they felt it would be effective in scenario 2 to help improve multilateralism and global governance if scenario 2 were to emerge. And then the third one is another one that we've put in because it seemed to come out of conversations that you were having in the groups last week. And then, although some of the groups, those of you who did manage to talk about vision, have a think about whether it would also be effective in your idea of your vision in the future. So you might struggle to get onto that conversation given time, and also because you might not be with the same people you're in from the earlier groups. We want you to spend 15 minutes having a go at this exercise. We'll break you out into your groups now. Just work through, see if idea 1 will work in scenario 1, scenario 2, and potentially in your vision. And do the same for idea 2 and idea 3. And then we'll come back and ask you to share share as a group, across your groups, kind of any ideas that you thought were particularly effective because they might work in multiple scenarios and your vision, or anything that you felt would be particularly important if that's scenario 1 or scenario 2 or your vision were to emerge. The idea that something might need modification is that idea that it could work, but it might need to be changed in this way or that way in a different scenario. So if you imagined having technology platforms to strengthen systems inclusivity and national decision making would work effectively in a scenario. If you had a lot more decision making being at a city level or kind of a breakdown in certain kind of aspects of society, would it still work effectively? And that's the kind of conversations we want you to have. So Ruth, if we're ready, we can break out and we'll have 15 minutes for this exercise. Again, please try and make sure you have a copy of this in the chat before we break out. And then we'll see you back in about 15 minutes. And please do, as Ruth says, signal to us if you need support and we can jump in to help you with the exercise. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to have a few minutes now for some reflections for how you found that. Can I maybe ask for, I think we had 5 groups in the breakout. So would someone from maybe the group with Angelica, Louisa, Vivienne, maybe just let us know how you found the exercise and whether there was any of the ideas that you came up with that felt they were either really robust or particularly important in one of the scenarios?
I think we felt that like the positive, the first scenario, there are so many negative effects that, or many negative elements that the positive ideas might help turn things around and bring them maybe in a bit more positive direction, but none of them would probably be able to resolve the underlying issues completely. So we felt that in that more positive second scenario, it was much more likely that those positive ideas would have an impact because the whole framework is more supportive.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think this is one of the common challenges we come across with wind tunneling, is getting the right framing for the question that you're exploring. I think what you're talking about shows one of those tensions, which is in the first scenario, there wasn't much you felt you could do to potentially shape that system, and maybe you're more thinking about what ideas you can implement to survive. And we sometimes talk about surviving and thriving in a scenario, and understanding whether you are in that kind of responsive, let's try and mitigate to survive in that scenario versus trying to actually shape and nurture and steer the future in a particular direction can be quite challenging sometimes in wind tunneling conversations. Can I ask for some reflections from some other groups? So I think there was a group with Iriana, Ottman and Annie in. How did you find this as an exercise? or feel free to jump in if other groups would like to share.
Annie or Elfman, would you like to go, perhaps, because I spoke in the previous?
Sure. I think sometimes it's just difficult to be sure, like, what is the cause and effect, and like, is this actually is this idea something that supports the scenario, or is the scenario something that, if we start with that, then the idea is something that brings a solution to that. So that's something we were discussing a bit, as well as, to me, it was always like, it depends on how you look at it, that how is the relationship between the idea and the scenario. Because you could, in a way, say to most of them that this works to strengthen or it needs modification. But I think it was a really good exercise to just challenge the way you think and see the scenarios.
Thank you. That's helpful to hear. And again, all of these are tools for thinking about implications in different ways. The wind tunneling can work quite effectively if you have multiple scenarios and you are doing that process of stress testing, checking whether the ideas that you've come up with might work, whether there might be unexpected consequences, and starting to think through systematically about that. Whereas the 3 horizons, which is more focused on that transition and pathways, can be quite a powerful tool for thinking about how you intervene within that scenario, horizon 2, as your scenario is starting to emerge to shape the future or to move it in a particular direction. So different use cases, slightly different use cases for different problems that you might be trying to address. Just going to pause for any final other reflections from anyone, any of the other groups who haven't shared yet. If there's anything anyone wants to add about how they found this exercise before we talk through one final technique.
We were just we put question marks under scenario 1 because all the ideas were positive. So then what effect do they have on scenario 1? I mean, in some ways it's a good thing, right? We're trying to deflect and get away from moving towards scenario 1, but we were a bit unclear how to best show that in the table. Our overall reflection was it was nice to have some positives, because we tend to, the problem with scenarios and the problem is often we get into this doomsday cycle of going, oh God, that's just awful. So it was good to have some positives to think about what are the steps that we might be able to take to help not move in that direction. So we came out positive, feeling more optimistic.
I think there is a risk with many scenario frameworks that you do end up with a more positive future and a more dystopic or dystopian future. And most scenarios will have pockets of positive and negative within them. If they are feeling either too utopic or dystopic, then it's worth thinking about trying to look for that positives that might emerge from within that kind of darker future, or vice versa. It's very rare that you'd be able to imagine a future that's going to impact everyone in a positive way. And people often use post-structuralist type questions or just basic ones, exploring kind of who are the winners and losers within the scenarios, to really think about what some of those kind of more negative, more positive aspects might be, and then thinking about how you encourage those or discourage those positive and negative elements within scenarios can be really, really powerful as well. Okay, any final reflections? If not, I'll move us on and just talk quickly about backcasting before summarizing kind of how to put all this together. Let's just pause for any final reflections. Okay, fine. So I'm going to move on now to talk about backcasting, which is quite a simple technique. I think it's quite intuitive. And the idea is for some of you may have used it, but if not, the idea is that you start in the future, you take your scenario or your vision is given, and you step back one step at a time to think about what would be happening before that, and then step back towards the present. It can be a very useful technique for testing whether a scenario might actually be possible or your vision might be possible, and sense checking that you can actually think of a way that that might emerge. Quite often it's you thinking from the present out, it can be hard to imagine certain scenarios or certain possibilities from happening, but it's thinking that they have happened and working back, you can sometimes imagine different and more innovative and novel ways that that scenario can emerge. So it's around thinking backwards to imagine how that scenario might have emerged. But it can also be used in different ways to help test the plausibility of your scenario, as I just mentioned, to understand the conditions that might cause the scenario to emerge. So in Three Horizons language, it's like if we step back from the future to that kind of transitioning period, what might happen that is a transition pathway to that future emerging. It can also be used to test the plausibility of your strategic options. So if you had an idea about, you wanted to, I'm going to use a trivial one from the news in the UK at the moment, which is around nuclear power. If you want to have built nuclear power station in 30 years' time, and you want to build 10 of them, if you step back, is it actually possible for that to be put in place in time? Or if not, we might need to consider an alternative strategy, is very much within the press in the UK at the moment. And it can also be used to identify emerging indicators of a scenario emerging. It can be very useful to create multiple backcasts. You could, if you have one scenario, you could imagine many different ways for it to emerge, or you might just imagine one. But by doing it multiple times, you can look, are there any kind of events in the middle or emerging that might be particularly critical nodes that if they were to happen, it would help encourage that scenario or that vision to come about. Or if it were to happen, if we see that as a signal that we can pick up as an event that happens, maybe say a shift in regulation, if that were to happen, that might unlock that scenario. And it might be a kind of key indicator that you want to monitor. It can also help you think about unintended consequences. So if you step back and say, okay, if this scenario were to merge, this event might happen and that might have an alternative consequence. So you can use backcasting in different ways. But the basic premise is really to start with the future and work backwards one step at a time to the present. And I'm going to give you an example again from the work we did in Nigeria. This isn't the best piece of work, but it helps to illustrate the point. So in 2030, there was a scenario where there was improved national security. There was better trade relations that had started to leverage technology. There was a flood of startups and innovation happening in Nigeria, and there were new technologies being used. So by 2030, this meant there was opportunities around off-grid communities being developed and falling renewable prices, more regional integration, higher GDP growth. And they had these as their future kind of scenario, and then they stepped back to what would need to be in place before that in 2022, 2020, and 2019. So in the case of off-grid communities and falling renewable prices, that means before that, they need to have falling costs, and they need to have changes in regulatory restrictions to allow new entrants into the market within the system, and more investment incentives. And stepping back to the present, where we have high tariffs, unreliable power supply in underserved communities, it meant that there was an early warning indicator that where the regulatory restrictions were to relax to allow new entrants, this would mean that they could put in place different strategies to develop their own decentralized power and start investing in technologies that otherwise wouldn't be worthwhile because they're not going to lead to good outcomes for either them as an organization or for the community that they're working in. So that kind of regulatory restriction would be a potential emerging indicator. And if there was a sense that was happening, they could then put in different strategies or policies in place to react to that emerging future. So it's kind of working backwards, identifying those signs of change that you can then monitor, and might mean that you put different strategies, options, policies in place. So that's the kind of premise of backcasting. And if we talk about what that means for us as we're kind of thinking about the implications, we need to start thinking about how we can put this all together. So we've been through the three horizons: visioning, wind tunneling, backcasting, and they're just for many tools that can be used to help you think about what it is you can do today to start to encourage a preferred future. So you need to understand what that preferred future looks like, how it differs from other alternative futures. So what's structurally different, and what is it you can do in that kind of horizon 2 or even today to move the future in a particular direction. You need to start to think about how you can prepare for less desirable futures. So either to steer the future away from that happening if you think if they're starting to emerge, or to be able to thrive and survive more effectively in that future if it does emerge. And ultimately, how you can monitor the signals of change that allow you to know when to act and when to put certain strategies or policies into place. So we often talk about having a policy portfolio or a portfolio of strategic options. And again, it comes down to what are those things that you could do? What are those options? Which ones do you want to do today because they're going to be leading to good outcomes? So they need to be impactful and they need to be effective against alternative futures. What are those ones today that you might want to do and just bet on effectively because they're going to be really important if the future shifts in a particular direction. And you need time to be able to put them into place. If they're things you can just switch on, then a monitoring strategy where you can look for the early warning indicators and effectively just if you see it's happening, you put that policy into place or that option or put that innovation, get that innovation up and running. But if it's going to take 10 years to do that, then you need to be doing that today because it's really important in that future. So what are those, where are you going to put your kind of strategic bets effectively? What are you going to do now? What might you do later? And what would be a signal that you should start actioning that in the future? And wind tunneling and backcasting can be useful ways of starting to put together some of those strategic options. But ultimately, wherever you sit within the system, you'll have certain levers, certain capabilities, and certain possibilities for things that you can actually influence. So understanding what's in your control, what's outside of your control is also really important. So we talk about this as a kind of a policy portfolio approach, understanding your vision, prioritizing interventions that will help you achieve that, preparing for less desirable futures, implementing no regret strategies, things that are robust and significant, investing in important strategies anyway to mitigate risk, and then setting up the scanning, monitoring, and evaluation systems that can help you be responsive, become more anticipatory, and be ready to act as the future emerges or as systems unlock. Sometimes there'll be a moment in time where you'll see a change between those three horizons that we're talking about. Some kind of crisis point or some inflection point, which means that a new pattern or a new dominant pattern is coming through. And being ready to act if that happens is really important. And the final thing is just to acknowledge there are some things that you won't be able to foresee or be able to predict, or even know if they're going to be impactful. And when you're in those kind of highly complex environments, sometimes you just need to be willing to experiment and innovate and sense and react, and then kind of in the language of complexity theory, kind of that idea of acting, sensing and responding, and just trying things out to see if they're going to have positive outcomes might become necessary. But for those things that you can start to anticipate, it is having that kind of evaluation system and monitoring and linking it into your risk and your strategy and your policy approaches that becomes really important. So I just have a couple of final reflections and we'll pause for any questions before I hand back to Marius to close out. And the final reflections are choosing and using tools in combination to gain different types of insights. As we've talked about, depending on the purpose that you're using futures tools, you may want to choose different implication tools. And quite often it's working with your existing strategy and policy tools to build on top of existing frameworks and bringing in that futures lens that becomes important. But it's important to understand how to map beyond scenarios, to explore the implications of the actual scenarios, as well as exploring how they might emerge. That becomes important. And then just identifying the strategic choices to shape the future the future you want, and to build that preparedness, and considering implications from different points of views through multiple lenses to gain the different valuable perspectives. And then we'll be talking about this in future modules, but trying to communicate this impactfully can also be critical to help capture the attention of decision makers and the communities that you're wanting to either influence or to come with you on that journey to create change. So at that point, I'm going to pause. I think we have about 10 minutes left. So if there are any questions on any of the material today, very happy to pick some of those up now. And before I hand over to Marius to close. So just pause for any final questions or reflections. Okay. Marius, I'll hand over to you then.
Thank you, Pete, and thanks for being good on time management as always. So colleagues, today was a very important session on deriving implications, and there are a number of touch points with what Pete was sharing today about implications, how we arrive at them, that link through to where we go next in the program. Very importantly, next week, Monday, we're going to be focusing in on, if we have these implications identified, how do we communicate those implications successfully within the institution, within the organization that we're part of? And so there's a logical building block process from where we've come from with Johan about identifying implications with 3 horizons, using other tools like wind tunneling, which we did today, to communicating those implications we're going to be discussing on Monday. Now, importantly, before we get to Monday, we are meeting you on Thursday this week for our second experiments clinic. We'd like to encourage you to prepare for the experiments clinic by working on your own experiment. Some of you have a clear experiment that's well developed. I know we've heard from Sandor and Louisa on their experiments. Others are still quite uncertain about what your experiment is likely to be. And so to help you with that process between now and Thursday, feel free to visit the expanded Foresight template, the experiments template that we've provided for you in house space. I'm sure Johan or Delphine can assist us in getting us the link to that in the chat. If you spend some time between today and Thursday, taking a look at that template, thinking about your experiment and populating that template, that will put you in a strong position to participate actively in Thursday's clinic. And that will prepare you, of course, also for next week when we talk about communicating implications. We have a couple of minutes to spare. So let me see if there are any questions that we can cover. Thank you, Delphine. I see Delphine has put that link in the chat. Thank you for that support. Any other questions that we could cover on identifying implications and how they link to our strategies?
There's one in the chat from Louisa Marius, which is about what happens if different tools give different implications that contradict each other for the same scenario. I'll just pick up on that quickly, and then maybe Marius, please do add. It depends on probably what the reason is for why they're contradictory. It could be that the scenario itself is being interpreted in different ways by different people. It could be that there are different perspectives on what that kind of vision or the preferred future looks like. Or it could be that the scenario that they're just maybe different ways of interpreting, and so kind of trying to understand the underlying reason is probably the key thing, and understanding where those differences have come from, and why that is, so that you can then focus in on kind of the underlying issues around that. And sometimes tools like CLA or other approaches could help you understand kind of what that underlying kind of values or worldview are that's driving that different perspective. Marius, I'm not sure if there's anything you'd like to add to that as well.
Pete, I think it's an interesting one. It's not something that happens very often where you have contradictory implications arising from a single scenario, but I think you're right that there would be reasons why that's happening, and it's often got to do with the lens of the person looking at that scenario. Having said that, if you think about a particular scenario and you think about the implications for a particular institution, different individuals sitting in different parts of the institution will experience that scenario very differently. So the implications for them might look very different. If I take a practical example based on the UN, if you have someone who's in the UN using technology for engagement, they might see a scenario in which the UN becomes a much more virtually orientated entity as a positive scenario for them, because that's their area, whereas a person who's an expert in shuttle diplomacy at the UN might feel like, oh my goodness, we're losing the core value of the institution. And so it is, I think, about those different perspectives, but we wouldn't see those as being contradictory, even though they might be opposite. They in fact could be complementary, because you would be learning broader insights about the institution, even though you have seemingly contradictory implications arising. It's a great question. It's an interesting one. Any other questions around implications? All the tools we've shared, backcasting, wind tunneling. Let me reiterate that we're always available on the Q&A. Thank you for those who have been using the Q&A to put some questions in there. Also, if you missed a particular question or answer in the chat or in the session, those are being put into the Q&A on HouseSpace. And so feel free to visit the Q&A if you have a question ahead of Thursday. Thanks, Delphine, for that link as well. Other than that, we look forward to seeing you Thursday. Have a lovely week and looking forward to working with you on your experiments on Thursday. All the best.